The most powerful person in the room is often the one who does not need to prove they belong there. On a quiet evening in downtown Chicago, a woman walked into an elegant restaurant carrying nothing but a small handbag, a calm expression, and the confidence of someone who had spent a lifetime standing for what was right. Nobody at the entrance recognized her. Nobody stopped to ask about her achievements. Nobody knew the decisions she had made, the battles she had fought, or the responsibility she carried every day. To everyone around her, she was simply another guest looking for a peaceful dinner. Her name was Amelia Richardson. At 54 years old, Amelia had learned that true influence was not measured by how many people knew your name. It was measured by how you treated people when no one knew who you were. The restaurant was filled with the ordinary sounds of an evening in America. Glasses touched tables. Conversations moved through the room. Families enjoyed dinner together. Business meetings continued quietly in the corner. It was the kind of place where people came to relax after a long day. Amelia chose a seat near the window and looked out at the city lights. For a moment, everything felt normal. She was not there as a public figure. She was not there as someone with a title. She was there as a person. But sometimes, the moments that reveal the most about society begin when nobody expects anything unusual to happen. Across the room, Officer Matthew Caldwell entered the restaurant after receiving a request for assistance. At 43 years old, he had spent years wearing the uniform of a police officer. To him, the badge represented order, responsibility, and authority. But over time, he had also become too comfortable believing that his first impressions were always correct. He looked around the restaurant, observing the situation through his own assumptions. He noticed Amelia sitting quietly near the window. He did not know her history. He did not know her position. He only saw what he believed he was seeing. And that was where the first mistake began. Amelia noticed him approaching, but she remained calm. She had spent decades inside courtrooms where emotions could rise quickly and where patience often revealed more than arguments ever could. She understood that people sometimes made decisions before they understood the full story. "Good evening, officer," she said politely. Her voice was steady. Her expression showed no anger. Matthew expected resistance. He expected someone trying to challenge him. Instead, he met a woman who simply wanted to be heard. Around them, a few guests began paying attention. The atmosphere changed slightly. Conversations became quieter. Employees watched carefully from behind the counter. Restaurant manager Thomas Brooks noticed the tension and started walking closer, unsure of what would happen next. What nobody in that room understood was that this quiet woman sitting by the window had spent her entire career studying the very principles being tested in that moment. She knew that fairness was not only important in courtrooms. It mattered in restaurants, workplaces, streets, and every place where one person had power over another. Matthew believed he was handling a simple situation. He believed his judgment was enough. He believed the uniform gave him the final word. But he did not realize that the woman standing before him represented something far greater than a title. She represented the idea that justice should never depend on appearance, assumptions, or first impressions. And as the evening continued, the room slowly moved toward a moment that would change how everyone there understood power, respect, and the meaning of true authority. The moment a person believes they already know the truth is often the moment they stop searching for it. Inside the quiet restaurant in downtown Chicago, the atmosphere slowly changed as Officer Matthew Caldwell stood near Amelia Richardson's table. Around them, people continued watching, each person trying to understand what was happening. Nobody wanted to create a scene. Nobody wanted to make the wrong assumption. But everyone could feel that something important was unfolding. Amelia remained seated with the same calm expression she had carried from the beginning. She did not raise her voice. She did not demand special treatment. She simply looked at Matthew and waited for him to explain his concerns. That patience surprised him. Over the years, Matthew had learned to expect immediate reactions when people were questioned. He expected arguments. He expected frustration. But Amelia offered something different. She offered a reminder that respect could exist even in difficult moments. "Officer Caldwell, I understand you have a responsibility," Amelia said. "But responsibility also means making sure we understand the people in front of us." Her words were simple, but they carried a meaning that reached beyond the restaurant. Thomas Brooks, the restaurant manager, watched carefully from a short distance away. He had managed the restaurant for almost a decade. and he had learned that every guest carried a story that was invisible at first glance. He had seen important executives sit quietly at tables. He had seen ordinary customers show extraordinary kindness. He knew appearances rarely revealed the full truth. Matthew looked around the room. The attention from other guests was becoming impossible to ignore. He believed he was protecting order, but something about the situation felt different from what he expected. Amelia was not behaving like someone who wanted conflict. She was behaving like someone who believed fairness still mattered. The contrast between them became clear. Matthew carried the authority of a uniform. Amelia carried the confidence of a lifetime spent understanding the law. One relied on immediate judgment. The other relied on patience and evidence. For Amelia, this moment was not only about herself. She thought about every person who had ever been judged before being understood. She thought about the importance of listening before deciding. She knew that justice was not only written in legal documents. It was reflected in everyday choices made by ordinary people. Meanwhile, Matthew continued believing he was dealing with a situation he already understood. He did not know the details of Amelia's life. He did not know the responsibility she carried. He did not know the years of dedication behind her quiet voice. And perhaps the most important thing he did not know was that the woman sitting in front of him had spent her career asking the same questions that were now being asked of him. What does fairness require? What does responsibility mean? What happens when assumptions replace understanding? The restaurant became more than a place where people gathered for dinner. It became a moment where two different ideas of authority stood across from each other. One idea believed power came from position. The other believed power came from service. As the evening continued, more people began to notice the details. They noticed Amelia's patience. They noticed Thomas's concern. They noticed Matthew's certainty beginning to meet a situation he could not easily define. None of them knew that this encounter would soon reach far beyond the walls of the restaurant. None of them knew that the quiet woman by the window was carrying a truth that would change everything. For now, however, the only thing visible was a simple conversation between two strangers. But sometimes history does not begin with a loud announcement. Sometimes it begins with a quiet person choosing to remain calm while the world decides whether it is willing to listen. The quietest moments can sometimes reveal the loudest truths. Inside the Chicago restaurant, the conversation between Amelia Richardson and Officer Matthew Caldwell continued while the people around them slowly realized they were witnessing something more than a simple disagreement. The room remained calm, but the tension came from something deeper. It was not about a table, a meal, or a single misunderstanding. It was about what happens when someone with authority makes a decision before knowing the full story. Amelia looked at Matthew with patience. She had spent decades in courtrooms listening to complicated arguments, emotional testimony, and difficult truths. She understood that every situation had more than one perspective. "Officer Caldwell," she said, "before a decision is made, there should always be room for understanding." Matthew listened, but his confidence remained. He believed experience had taught him how to recognize problems quickly. He believed he was doing what his position required. But experience without reflection could sometimes become a barrier. It could make a person stop asking questions because they believed they already knew the answers. Thomas Brooks noticed the difference between the two people standing in front of him. Matthew represented authority through his uniform and official role. Amelia represented authority through her calm presence and the respect she showed to everyone around her. She was not trying to win an argument. She was trying to make sure the situation was handled fairly. A few guests quietly began sharing their observations with one another. They noticed that Amelia had remained respectful from the beginning. They noticed that she had not tried to use influence or demand special treatment. She simply asked to be treated like anyone else. That detail stayed with Thomas. In his years managing the restaurant, he had learned something important. The strongest people were often not the ones who demanded attention. They were the ones who remained composed when others expected them to lose control. Matthew glanced around the room and realized more people were paying attention than he expected. For the first time that evening, he seemed aware that this moment was not only between him and Amelia. Other people were learning from what they saw. Every choice made in public could send a message about what kind of community people wanted to create. Amelia understood this clearly. She knew moments like this could become examples of either division or understanding. She did not want anyone in the restaurant to leave believing that anger was the answer. She wanted them to understand that fairness required patience. Behind her calm expression was a lifetime of experiences that shaped the way she viewed justice. She remembered moments when people underestimated her. She remembered moments when others focused on appearances before recognizing ability. But those experiences did not make her bitter. They made her more determined to protect the principles she believed in. Matthew, however, still did not know the person standing before him. He did not know the challenges she had overcome. He did not know the responsibilities she carried. He only saw the situation through a narrow view created by assumptions. And that was the lesson waiting for him. Sometimes the biggest mistakes are not made because people lack information. They are made because people believe they have enough information already. The evening continued, but something had changed. The restaurant was no longer just a place where people came for dinner. It had become a place where a powerful question was quietly being asked. Would people judge based on what they saw first, or would they take the time to discover the truth? Nobody in that room knew the full story yet. Nobody knew Amelia's true identity. Nobody understood why her calmness came from years of experience. But soon, the truth behind the quiet woman by the window would begin to emerge, and when it did, everyone would have to reconsider what they thought they knew. Sometimes the truth does not arrive with a dramatic announcement. Sometimes it appears through small details that people ignored at first. Inside the Chicago restaurant, the evening continued, but the atmosphere had changed. The guests who had been focused on their own conversations were now paying attention to the quiet exchange between Amelia Richardson and Officer Matthew Caldwell. They did not know the full story yet, but they could sense that something important was happening. Thomas Brooks stood nearby, carefully observing every moment. As the restaurant manager, he had dealt with difficult situations before, but this felt different. There was something unusual about Amelia's calmness. Most people who felt misunderstood immediately tried to explain themselves. Amelia did not. She did not rush to defend her reputation. She did not mention her achievements. She did not use her influence to change the situation. She simply continued asking for fairness. That was what stayed in Thomas's mind. He began wondering who this woman really was. Amelia had always believed that a person's character was revealed during ordinary moments, not just important ones. Anyone could act with confidence when people were watching. The real test came when someone had the ability to respond differently but chose patience. Instead, throughout her life, Amelia had faced moments when others focused on what they saw before understanding who she was. She remembered being underestimated, but she also remembered the people who looked beyond appearances and recognized her determination. Those experiences shaped the way she approached every challenge. She understood that people could make mistakes, but she also believed that people had the ability to learn from them. Across the room, Matthew continued standing with the certainty that he was handling the situation correctly. He had spent years believing that quick decisions were signs of strength. In his mind, hesitation created problems. But he had not considered that listening could also be a form of strength. The difference between them was becoming clearer. Matthew saw authority as something connected to position. Amelia saw authority as something connected to responsibility. One came from a badge. The other came from a lifetime of service. Thomas eventually approached and gently asked if there was anything he could do to help. Amelia thanked him and told him she appreciated his willingness to listen. That simple response surprised him. She was not angry at him for being uncertain. She understood that many people found themselves in difficult situations where they had to decide whether to stay silent or speak with honesty. Her response was not about blaming individuals. It was about encouraging better choices. Later that evening, as the restaurant became quieter, a few employees discussed what they had witnessed. They talked about how Amelia never tried to make herself appear more important than anyone else. They talked about how she remained respectful even when she felt misunderstood. Those small observations began creating a different picture of the situation. The woman they first saw as a quiet customer was slowly becoming someone they wanted to understand. Meanwhile, Matthew still had no idea how significant this moment would become. He believed the evening would end like any other call. He believed the conversation would disappear once everyone went home. But some moments do not disappear. Some moments become turning points because they force people to confront questions they avoided for years. What happens when confidence becomes assumption? What happens when authority forgets compassion? What happens when the person you underestimate is the person who understands justice better than anyone around you? As the restaurant prepared to close, Amelia looked out at the city lights through the window. She remained calm because she knew the truth did not need to be forced. Truth had its own way of moving forward. The people in the restaurant did not know it yet, but the quiet woman they had watched that night carried a story far greater than they imagined. And soon, the world would discover that the person Matthew Caldwell believed he understood was someone he had never truly seen at all. The most important truths are often the ones people discover after they stop looking at appearances and start paying attention to character. The morning after the unexpected evening at the Chicago restaurant, the story continued quietly. There were no headlines yet, no public statements, no dramatic reactions. But inside the restaurant, the people who had witnessed the moment were beginning to think differently about what they had seen. Thomas Brooks arrived early that morning, walking through the same dining area where the tension had unfolded the night before. He looked toward the window table where Amelia Richardson had been sitting and remembered every detail. He remembered her calm voice. He remembered her patience. He remembered how she never once tried to make herself seem more important than anyone else. The more he thought about it, the more he realized something unusual had happened. The person with the greatest reason to demand respect had been the person who showed the most respect to others. Thomas decided to review the restaurant security footage, not because he wanted to create a problem, but because he wanted to understand the situation completely. He believed that fairness required facts, not assumptions. As the footage played, he watched the evening unfold from another perspective. He saw Amelia enter peacefully. He saw her remain composed throughout the conversation. He saw how she listened carefully and responded with patience. He also saw something else. He saw how quickly a person could form an opinion before knowing the full story. That realization stayed with him. The footage was not just a record of what happened. It was a reminder of how important it was to slow down before making judgments. Later that day, Thomas spoke with some of the employees who had been present. They shared similar thoughts. They all remembered the same thing about Amelia. She never acted as if she was above anyone. She treated every person in the restaurant with the same courtesy. That detail mattered because it revealed something deeper about her character. Respect was not something she demanded from others. It was something she practiced herself. Meanwhile, Officer Matthew Caldwell continued his regular duties, unaware that the events from the restaurant were beginning to receive attention. To him, the situation had ended. He believed he had simply handled another difficult interaction. But what he did not understand was that every decision made by someone with authority creates a lasting impression. People remember not only what happens, but how they are treated during those moments. Matthew had always believed that experience gave him the ability to judge situations quickly, but he was beginning to face a question that many people avoid. What if being experienced does not always mean being right? What if confidence without reflection can lead someone away from fairness? Amelia, meanwhile, continued her life with the same quiet discipline she had always shown. She did not search for attention. She did not contact anyone to explain who she was. She understood that the truth did not need to be announced immediately to be powerful. She had spent years inside courtrooms learning that evidence mattered more than assumptions. She believed that people deserved the opportunity to be understood before they were judged. That evening in the restaurant was not about proving her importance. It was about showing why every person deserved dignity regardless of their position. As the days passed, the security footage and witness accounts began moving through the proper channels. The focus was no longer on a misunderstanding inside a restaurant. It became a larger conversation about responsibility, fairness, and the way authority should be used. Thomas looked back at the footage one more time and realized the most powerful moment was not when someone spoke the loudest. It was when Amelia remained calm while everyone else was uncertain. Because sometimes the person with the least need to prove themselves is the person carrying the greatest truth. And soon, the world would discover exactly who that quiet woman by the window really was. The truth does not always arrive as a surprise. Sometimes it arrives as a process, slowly moving through careful review until the facts become impossible to ignore. In the days following the evening at the Chicago restaurant, the situation began entering a new stage. What started as a private moment between two people was becoming a matter that required attention, reflection, and accountability. Thomas Brooks had provided the security footage and his observations, but he never imagined how important those details would become. He believed that every person deserved to be understood fairly, and he wanted the full picture to be available before anyone reached a conclusion. Inside the department office, Officer Matthew Caldwell was asked to participate in a formal review of the interaction. At first, he believed the process would simply confirm what he already thought. He believed his actions came from experience and responsibility. He believed he had handled the situation based on what he saw at the time. But as the review began, he was asked to do something more difficult than explaining his decisions. He was asked to examine them. The officials reviewing the situation did not focus only on one moment. They looked at the entire sequence of events. They reviewed the available information, listened to witnesses, and considered the impact of every decision made during that evening. The purpose was not to create a villain. The purpose was to understand whether authority had been used with the level of responsibility expected from someone in that position. Matthew sat quietly as the details were presented. For the first time, he began seeing the situation from another perspective. He noticed things he had overlooked. He noticed Amelia's patience. He noticed that she never attempted to use her influence to avoid the conversation. He noticed that she continued treating everyone around her with respect, even when she felt misunderstood. Those details challenged the way he remembered the evening. Across the city, Amelia continued focusing on her responsibilities. She did not follow the review closely. She did not demand a particular outcome. She trusted the process because she believed fairness required patience. Her entire career had been built on that principle. Justice was not about reaching the fastest conclusion. Justice was about reaching the right conclusion based on truth and understanding. Thomas reflected on the experience as well. He thought about how easily people could be judged by a single moment. He thought about how often society created opinions before learning the full story. The restaurant had become a reminder that every person carried experiences, achievements, and struggles that were invisible to others. Matthew began facing a difficult realization. He had spent years believing that being decisive was always a strength. But he was learning that true responsibility required the courage to question yourself. It required the humility to consider that your first impression might not contain the whole truth. That lesson was uncomfortable because it challenged the way he viewed himself. He had always considered himself someone who protected fairness. Now he had to ask whether his actions had reflected the values he claimed to represent. The review continued carefully, and more people became aware that the situation involved much more than a disagreement at a restaurant. It was about trust. It was about the relationship between authority and the people it serves. It was about whether a person with power could recognize the humanity of someone standing in front of them. As the process moved forward, one thing became clear. Amelia Richardson never needed to announce who she was to deserve respect. Her dignity existed before anyone knew her position. Her character was visible through her actions. And for Matthew Caldwell, the most important discovery was not about the woman he had encountered. It was about himself. Because sometimes the hardest truth to accept is not the truth about another person. It is the truth we discover when we finally look honestly at our own choices. The moment when a hidden truth is finally revealed is not always the loudest moment in the room. Sometimes it happens quietly, with a simple introduction that changes the way everyone sees the past. After days of careful review, the situation surrounding the restaurant incident reached a point where the facts could no longer remain incomplete. The officials involved had examined the available information, listened to those who were present, and understood that the most important part of the story was not a position or a title. It was the truth of what happened. Officer Matthew Caldwell entered the meeting room believing he was prepared for another review. He expected questions about procedures and decisions. He expected a conversation about the evening at the restaurant. What he did not expect was how much his understanding of that night would change. The room was quiet as the documents were placed on the table. The people around him knew the significance of the moment. They knew there was more to the story than what had been visible at first glance. Then Amelia Richardson walked into the room. Matthew looked up, recognizing the same calm expression he had seen at the restaurant. For a moment, nothing seemed different. She was still the same person who had spoken with patience and dignity. But then the room changed. The officials stood. The atmosphere shifted. And Matthew realized that the woman he had treated like an ordinary customer was someone whose life represented the very principles being discussed. Officer Caldwell, this is Justice Amelia Richardson, one of the officials said. The words were simple, but their meaning was powerful. Matthew remained silent. The realization did not come from fear or embarrassment. It came from understanding. The person he had judged without knowing the full story had spent her entire career protecting fairness, responsibility, and the importance of being heard. Amelia did not look at him with anger. She did not use the moment to make him feel small. Instead, she simply carried the same calm presence she had shown from the beginning. That was what made the moment unforgettable. She had the authority to demand recognition, but she never needed to ask for it. Her actions had already shown who she was. Matthew thought back to the restaurant. He remembered how certain he had been. He remembered believing he understood the situation immediately. Now he saw the difference between having authority and understanding responsibility. A badge could represent service, but it could never replace judgment, compassion, or fairness. Amelia addressed the room with the same steady voice she had used that evening. She explained that the purpose of the review was not personal. It was not about one person defeating another. It was about learning from moments when assumptions could influence decisions. She believed that every person deserved to be seen as a human being before being seen as anything else. Her words reached everyone in the room, including Matthew. For him, this was not just a professional lesson. It was a personal one. He began to understand that the greatest responsibility of authority was not control. It was trust. Trust from the people being served. Trust from the community. Trust that decisions would be made with fairness and respect. Outside the meeting room, the story continued to spread among those who had followed the situation. People talked about the woman who never needed to announce her importance. They talked about the officer who learned that appearances could never tell the complete story. And they talked about the lesson hidden inside the entire experience. A person's value does not come from what others assume about them. It comes from who they truly are. Amelia Richardson walked away from the meeting the same way she had walked into the restaurant. Calm, focused, humble. She did not seek a victory. She sought understanding. And in that moment, everyone learned something important. True justice does not become powerful because of the person who holds authority. True justice becomes powerful because it protects the dignity of every person involved. The greatest lessons in life are not always learned when people succeed. Sometimes they are learned when people are forced to face the consequences of their own choices and decide what kind of person they want to become. After the meeting where Amelia Richardson's identity was revealed, the focus shifted from the surprise of that moment to the deeper meaning behind it. The issue was never simply about one evening at a restaurant. It was about responsibility, trust, and the importance of seeing people clearly before making decisions about them. Officer Matthew Caldwell returned to his daily routine with a different perspective. The uniform he wore looked the same. The streets he protected were the same. But his understanding of what it meant to serve had changed. For years, he believed authority was measured by confidence and quick decisions. Now he began to understand that true authority required something more difficult. It required humility. The official review continued carefully, focusing on facts and the responsibility expected from someone in his position. The conclusion was not based on Amelia's title. It was based on the actions that took place and the standards that every person with public responsibility must follow. The process showed that a position of authority comes with an obligation to treat every individual with fairness and respect. Matthew had to accept the outcome of that process. His role within the department changed, and the badge he had always viewed as a symbol of responsibility was no longer the same symbol in his mind. He realized that a badge was never meant to create distance between an officer and the community. It was meant to represent service to the people who trusted it. Meanwhile, Amelia continued moving forward with the same quiet strength she had shown from the beginning. She did not celebrate Matthew's difficulties. She did not see the situation as a personal victory. She saw it as an opportunity for reflection. Throughout her career, she had learned that justice was not about making someone feel defeated. It was about creating a better understanding of what fairness should look like. Thomas Brooks also carried the memory of that evening with him. The restaurant returned to its normal rhythm, with guests enjoying meals and conversations once again. But for Thomas and his employees, the experience remained a reminder that every person who enters a room carries a story that others may never see. They remembered Amelia not because of her position, but because of her character. They remembered the way she remained respectful even when she had every reason to be frustrated. They remembered that dignity is revealed most clearly during difficult moments. Matthew eventually reflected on everything that happened. He thought about the assumptions he had made. He thought about how quickly he believed he understood a situation without knowing the person involved. That reflection was uncomfortable, but it was necessary. Growth often begins when people are willing to recognize the distance between who they believe they are and who their actions show them to be. Amelia's message remained simple. People should not have to prove their worth before receiving basic respect. A person's appearance, background, or position should never decide whether they are treated with dignity. That principle was bigger than one restaurant, one officer, or one evening. It was about the kind of society people choose to build every day. As the story moved forward, those who knew about the situation remembered one powerful lesson. The strongest form of justice does not come from humiliation or revenge. It comes from truth, accountability, and the willingness to learn. Matthew Caldwell lost the confidence he once placed only in his badge, but he gained a deeper understanding of the responsibility behind it. Amelia Richardson never needed a title to show her strength, because her actions had already spoken for her. And in the end, the moment that changed everything was not when the world discovered who she was. It was when everyone understood what she had represented all along. The most meaningful moments in life are not always remembered because of what happened. They are remembered because of what people chose to do afterward. In the weeks following the events at the Chicago restaurant, the story continued to live on in the minds of everyone who had witnessed it. The restaurant returned to its familiar rhythm. Guests came and went. Conversations filled the room. The window table where Amelia Richardson had once sat quietly became just another place where people shared a meal. But for those who had been there that evening, it represented something much greater. It represented a reminder that every person deserves to be seen beyond assumptions. Thomas Brooks often thought about that night. He remembered how quickly people formed opinions without knowing the full story. He remembered how easily a person could be judged by appearance before anyone understood their character. But most of all, he remembered Amelia's response. She had every reason to demand attention. She had every reason to reveal her identity immediately. Yet she chose patience. She chose dignity. She chose to allow the truth to appear naturally. That choice stayed with him because it showed something powerful. Real confidence does not need to announce itself. Real strength does not need to prove that it exists. Amelia continued her work with the same dedication she had always shown. Her position carried great responsibility, but she never allowed that responsibility to separate her from the people around her. She believed that justice was not only found in important decisions or official places. It was found in everyday interactions. It was found in how people spoke to one another, how they listened, and how they treated those whose stories they did not yet know. Matthew Caldwell also carried the memory of that evening differently than before. The experience changed the way he looked at his role. He understood that public service was not simply about following procedures. It was about understanding the people behind every situation. It was about recognizing that every person had a story, and that story mattered. The lesson was not easy, but it was necessary. Matthew learned that authority without empathy could create distance, while authority guided by respect could build trust. Months later, the encounter remained a quiet example of how one moment could challenge a person's understanding of themselves. It was not a story about one person winning and another person losing. It was a story about awareness. It was about the importance of slowing down, listening carefully, and remembering that first impressions are rarely the complete truth. Amelia and Matthew came from different experiences. They carried different perspectives. But through that difficult moment, both were reminded of something universal. Every person deserves dignity. Every person deserves fairness. And every person has the ability to choose what happens after a mistake is made. The most important change was not that people discovered Amelia's identity. The most important change was that people discovered the value of treating someone with respect before knowing their importance. Because respect should never depend on a title. It should never depend on status. It should never depend on whether someone can influence your future. It should exist simply because every human being deserves it. Looking back, the restaurant was never just a restaurant. It became a place where assumptions were challenged and understanding was gained. It became a place where a quiet woman showed that dignity could be stronger than anger. It became a place where an officer learned that responsibility was greater than authority. And it became a reminder that justice is not only something written in laws or discussed in courtrooms. Justice lives in the choices people make every single day. He thought the badge defined his power, but he learned that true justice was never about who held the authority. It was about who had the courage to protect the dignity of others.